Welcome everyone to the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night Creator Convos. I'm Noelle Marshall and I'm here with my beloved Bob Warner.
Hi everyone, welcome Tex. Thank you for bringing these wonderful, wonderful conversationalists with us this evening and introducing them to our community and vice versa.
So together, Bob and I call ourselves life partners, and somehow we became the mom and pop of this wonderful organization called the Co-Creators Convergence as students of Barbara Marx Hubbard. So before we begin our evening, I want to show a very short video that tells a little bit about our group. So welcome everyone, and we were gifted this past summer by a wonderful composer, Gary Malkin, and he did beautiful meditation music, and Sarah McCrum supplied the poetry to go with it. So to bring us all in together as we begin this wonderful evening, I'm going to play just this short video just to bring us into resonance. So hold on just.
You are invited to experience unity. It's time to put aside the differences that divide us. And embrace the beauty of each one of us being different, being unique, being ourselves. In the essence of who we truly are. A beautiful array of human beings across the planet. So many different ways of being human. So let us get to know each other. Let's spend time with each other. Let's learn from each other. And let's open our hearts to each other. And let's find the unity that exists right in the middle of the richness of our diversity. We are human. We are unique. We are one.
I hope you enjoyed that transformance. And if you're not familiar with the term transformance, it was a spontaneous co-creation. Sarah McCrum actually was in New Zealand and who read the poetry, and Gary Malkin was in LA. And later on, Lewis Roberts added the video. So it was a beautiful co-creation. And I loved that. I think it's so appropriate for our discussion here tonight. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce, let me just explain how the Co-Creators Convergence Thursday night calls work. Is that we have a very special guest, and then we ask that guest, we go, well, Bob and I don't know all the fabulous, wonderful people in the world. Who would you think would make a good guest for us? And kind of do a pay it forward. And so Tex has been with us many times and he's brought us many wonderful guests. And so I'm looking forward to meeting our guests tonight, Tez Gabriel and Rich Shealy. And so my dear friend, Tex Albert, he is a wonderful curator, a wonderful friend, presence, and a beautiful soul lives in Quebec. And Tex, I just want to turn it over to you and thank you for bringing Rich and Tez to us to this wonderful evening. And I'll allow you to introduce our guests. So thank you everyone for coming. And just a reminder before we start is that you can put any questions or comments in the chat, and the chat will be monitored. And at the after Tez and Rich present what they want to present for us, then they will invite us in to conversation. So with that, I'm complete. Thank you so much for being here, and come back next Thursday.
Okay.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you, Noel and Bob, for curating Co-Creators Convergence. We are honored to be here this evening, and that Gary Malkin transformance music is very appropriate. I had the honor of co-hosting Tez Gabriel and Richard Shealy during the World Unity Week last June, and I'm very happy to have them here this evening. I'm happy, honored, and also very humbled because I know the passion in a way and how committed they have been over the decades. Now, friends, I asked us to be mindful that we are here presencing with each other. One action that we're doing is breathing. We are all breathing right now, and because we are breathing, we know we are alive. And we know that especially in these times, so many people all over the planet are having difficulty breathing, and all because of a little virus. So let us be grateful for that we are well and we are breathing. So by breathing, we are in oneness with everyone who's breathing the same air all over the planet. And as we intentionally focus on our heart also, as we nurture love, as we nurture goodwill towards someone else or towards situations, science has proven that actually anyone who's meditating intentionally, heart-centered, there are hundreds, thousands of photons that are emitted from the chest area, whereas a normal person is only about 20,000 photons. So we can be the change we want to see in the world. And the topic today will be calling us to not only be aware, but to be conscious. So I'd like to introduce Tez Gabriel, who is the Executive Director of Pathways to Peace. which is a UN Peace Messenger organization in consultation with the ECOSOC. And Tez works in partnership with peace builders locally and globally to build a culture of peace. We know that since 2000, the year 2000, there's been the decade for the culture of peace, but it's also an ongoing effort. All member states of the UN committed to the culture of peace and nonviolence. Tez is also the owner of and senior consultant for Gabriel Associates for 30 years. She has worked with mission-based organizations to create relevant, viable, and sustainable workplace environments that effect real change in our world. She is also an ordained minister who conducts interfaith and intercultural ceremonies and works with individuals and groups to empower the divine within each of us. Now, the main speaker this evening is Richard Shealy. Richard Shealy tells us that research has shown that unconscious racism in staff imprisons their greatness and the greatness of companies. That racism usually operates from unconscious memory stores, and employees may display attitudes, thinking, and execute behaviors that never connect to their conscious awareness, but are negative to the success of the business. Richard coaches CEOs, business owners, and pastors to minimize or eliminate the effects of race and racism on their corporate cultures. Now, Tez knows Richard very well for several years, and the conversation essentially will be run between Tez and Richard. So Tez, can you take over, please?
I would be happy to. Well, first of all, Rich and I are just really honored and delighted to be with you. We're in company with people who have made a commitment to co-creation and to co-creation of a better world, a world that exists in unity and oneness. So I'm just very grateful in this moment for the company that we are currently in. And so one might wonder why Rich and I come together to do these presentations. We've done quite a lot of them. The reason that we do that is that we believe that when we come together out of our differences and share our differences, that what surfaces is an honor, a respect for unity and the commonalities that we all share as human beings. I first became interested in Rich's work because at the base of it all is something I care very much about, which I believe is at the core of all sustainable change, which is love. And so Rich brings a transformative learning system based in his own experience, as well as his own learning and depth of knowledge. And I am here to provide some reflection, to maybe prompt some additional questions, and to the degree that we have time and interest to share my own experience in this issue of ending racism. For me, this has been a journey for about over 50 years. Began in the 60s in the civil rights movement, and then evolved into the anti-violence movement, where I really took a look at what is underneath what is underneath at the core that supports all violence. And it was systemic oppression. All of those isms that link together to keep all of us to a greater or lesser degree oppressed and promote violence. And so I greatly honor my colleague, Rich. In case you didn't get that yet, let me say that out loud. And tonight we're going to begin our time together with a poem that Rich wrote quite a long time ago. And I know that it's going to reach the depths of your heart. And so I would encourage you to maintain that open heart and that open mind that came through that beautiful meditation. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Thank you, Tez. Thank you, everyone. We are so very pleased to be here this evening to share this message. One point of possible confusion I want to clear up right away is that because I'm a person of color, you might think that the work we're presenting is about freeing people of color from racism. That would be an incorrect interpretation. What we are about is to free humanity from the prison of racism. This is a species level problem that is not being addressed. It's not being addressed because in many ways it's not understood. It is both a complex and a complicated problem. It has many, many levels, most of which are unconscious, and it has been misunderstood over the years. So we come tonight to create a very deep and very wide love zone, a zone in which you can feel safe to ask any question that you have about racism. All of those questions that you have been timid and unwilling to expose because you thought that in some way it might shed the wrong light on you. But here is your safe zone. Here is your opportunity to ask all of those questions. And I think between Tez and I, we will have an answer for you that might give you some relief. And we want to do that. So we're going to start with this poem that I wrote in 1959 when I was 17 years old. And the poem does not come from the mentality I had as a 17-year-old. As I have viewed this poem over the years, it is clear to me that this came by way of my intuition, and it was a message to me of a template for my life from what some people call a higher self. Some people call, they're all different kinds of names. I speak of it as my true self, my connection to the universe and my connection to source. And that is the origin of this poem. So Noel, if you could show the poem, we can start. I used to be white, or thought I was going to be. All of my heroes were alabaster saints, shrouded in their hypocrisy. My goals were Charlie's pleasure. Negro was my calling. Blinded by promises forever broken, God was my undoing. I used to be white, or wished I could have been. On the lap of my mother, I learned of Black sin, the sins of pride, arrogance, and thought. Whitey taught her. Bow your head, child. Can't win. Join the slaughter. I used to be white, to speak, live, and think right. The rationale of truth somehow passed from my sight. For who is to say I can never be Whitey? I'll pay my dues, shuffle, and thank God Almighty. I used to be white, and guess I'll always be a stranger, not this nor that, something less than me. I have been as stillborn, seeing not the light of day, but who can see or even wants to, whose mind's away. 6 interesting stanzas. I used to be white, or thought I was going to be. This is a consciousness that most young people of color go through early in their lives, prior to the 8 to 12 year range. It's during that 8 to 12 year range, there is a cognitive split, a recognition that who you hope to be in life is going to be compromised. And what you have to do is split your consciousness so that you have a consciousness when you're with your family and a consciousness with which you need to engage the world as you hope to be successful. And I think pretty much all people of color go through this. You also, when you come to the second stanza, you learn about the hypocrisy of the world. And you learn, maybe unconsciously, some of the challenges that you are going to need to deal with. The promises of citizenship that you're not likely to be able to receive in full measure. The way in which religion has been used in America from the beginning of the British colonies, where the church was one of the primary institutions that was used to create systemic racism. I used to be white, or wish I could have been. Why would a person of color be in that consciousness of wishing that they were white? Because you recognize, perhaps again unconsciously, but you recognize that if you're going to be amongst those who experience success, there is an easy pathway and there is a person of color's pathway. So many times, unconsciously, you might wish that you were white. On the lap of my mother, I learned of Black sin. Well, for parents of children of color, they're in a daunting circumstance. On the one hand, they want to encourage and teach their children to be successful, but at their unconscious levels, they're dealing with the same struggle, looking at their own barriers to success, their own experiences of racism. And what we have learned over the years is that this consciousness begins to be transferred to their children in utero through the unconscious of the mother. The child in utero is delivered the message of racism even before they're born. This is true regardless of the ethnicity. of the family, regardless of the ethnicity of the mother and of the child. The message of racism is beginning to be communicated in utero. I used to be white, to speak, live, and think right. Remember that split of consciousness. People of color are working with two different consciousnesses. And one consciousness is to learn how to figure out what are the seams in the deck of cards that's stacked against you. How do you figure out how to make lemonade out of lemons? I used to be white, and guess I'll always be a stranger, not this nor that, something less than me. I have been as stillborn, seeing not the light of day, but who can see or even wants to, whose mind's away? A stranger. It is an ongoing trauma to not be able to find who you are as you progress through life. It's like being stillborn. It's like being dead yet alive, because it is so difficult to identify your true self. And we're going to talk about that more. But this is the burden of systemic racism that people of color carry throughout their lives. It's like having a very large backpack filled with dense and heavy rocks that you carry every day. And you must learn how to make it work carrying that weight of systemic racism throughout your life. So that's the poem and a little bit of a commentary. Tez, do you have any reflections on what you felt as you read the poem for the first time?
Oh, well, first of all, I agree with our participants that it is incredibly powerful, Rich. And it kind of, for me, goes to my heart that any child should feel that they are not valued for who they are, that they have to be something different than who they are to be valued. And so I think, we have broken hearts when we hear that. Another thing that came up for me is I love that you talked about how parents and mothers are kind of doing the best they can for their child as they are grappling with their own daily interactions of racism. And one of the things that has come up in the groups that I've worked with, where African American mothers have said to their child that they have to be fearful because that's the only way they'll be protected, and is to instill fear. And it's legitimate because bad things happen to kids of color. And so to be fearful of the law enforcement, to be fearful of people who may be aggressive. And I just have always felt like systemic racism that permeates every system, as well as each of us, is just such a burden for parents who have the best interest of their children at heart, and yet have to deal with their own racism, racist interactions and experiences, as well as prepare their children as well to deal with those. So those were my initial thoughts, and I'd love to get a little bit more from you if you have more to share. And then I know we're going to spend some time going deeper into kind of the learning system. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it is it's hard to, it's hard to, even now, I have 3 children, and they all were successful. They all were able to, and are still living their lives beyond feeling constrained by racism. So I'm very, very happy about that. But at the same time, I feel the pain and concern of other parents of color. But I was born a what the social scientists and others call a highly sensitive person with an extremely strong intuition and sense of the life beyond life. And that always guided me and helped me. And over the years, I learned to trust my intuition and to follow it always. And that is what helped me. That is what helped me with my children, and hopefully contributed to their success. So over the years, I've been able to unpack racism and unpack what it means to be human, to understand that the baseline of humanity is not biology, that the baseline of humanity is energy and consciousness. And we really can't understand what it means to be human. We can't understand what it means to be one. Sorry for that. What it means to be one if we don't understand the energy that fulfills our humanity. When we look at humanity only through our biology, we're looking at an incomplete representation of our humanity. Our biology only constitutes something like 12.5% of our humanity. The energy is 87.5% or more. We are more energy beings than we are biological beings, or what we call human beings. And we need to understand that in order to end racism, racism needs to be ended for the benefit of humanity, because we cannot fully experience our greatness. We cannot fully experience our oneness until we understand the energetic part of who we are. We want to understand the why of racism, the what of racism, the how of racism, the when of racism, the complications and complexity of racism, the toxicity of racism. And that's possibly something that we have got to learn more about, the toxicity of racism, the language of racism, and the mysteries of racism. These are all of the topics that we must unpack, and these are all of the topics of my work as I try to help people understand how to free themselves from their unconscious identifications and unconscious attachments to racism. Today, there are two court cases going on in America, one in Kenosha, Wisconsin, one in Georgia. Both of those juries are dealing with the issues of race as they go through a trial where so-called white people are on trial for murders that are racially related. And how do you pick a jury that has the kind of balance and non-attachment that they can render an equitable verdict? And we question that. We question that particularly in the case in Kenosha, where the judge has announced to the jury and the lawyers that the victims of the shooting cannot be called victims in the trial, but they can be called rioters and other negative names. So racism raises its head once again. So this is the trial, a trial of humanity that we have to face, not only in these cases, but in everyday life. As we look at what is going on politically in America, we need to understand that what is going on politically is not about politics. What is going on politically is about the desire of a group of our fellow citizens who want to stay in control and to keep the nation unconsciously identified with race and racism. Don't get it twisted. That's what's really is happening. So we won't be able to talk about all of those things tonight, but I wanted to make sure that I spoke about that. So Tez, back to you.
All of that was just perfect. And so I think I'd like to just touch back a little bit on this concept. And I know you're going to build more on this through the learning system portion of our time together too, Rich. But truly, you and I meet in our commonalities around the issue of being sensitive intuitives. And also, I think I'm going to speak for both of us because I know this to be true, really being empaths, having empathy, which has certainly aided both of us in all of our life work. And for both of us, that started when we were really young. And this concept of being energy beings, I just want to emphasize that is so important to our recognition of unity, because that's where we meet. That's our energetic connection.
Yes.
And so regardless of this virtual reality suit we're wearing in our 3D world, as energy beings, we are all connected. And so I love your work around that, and just wanted to take us back just a little bit. And you can respond or not, it doesn't matter, because you've already said it, to the importance of energy consciousness as it goes hand in hand with unity consciousness and oneness consciousness.
Yes.
So back to you, my friend.
Yes. And that's where we headed as a human family. We're headed to an understanding and an ability to enter oneness consciousness. Now, there are many people who have questions about oneness consciousness. What are we really talking about? Some time ago, there was an experiment that you can Google called now I'm going to block on the experiment. Anyway, the experiment showed that the human brain is capable of processing information from 11 levels of consciousness beyond the normal everyday consciousness that that we use all of the time. And the most important level of consciousness for me that we can have access to is oneness consciousness, where we're all one. And I call it the consciousness of not yet. And what I mean by that is it is a consciousness within which all potentials that we can experience is contained. Everything that is possible is in that consciousness of oneness. And everything within that consciousness is one. And all of us emerge from that oneness consciousness. And it is the consciousness of all potentials, and they're not yet. And what we need to be able to do is to get back to that sense of oneness, so that all of the perceived differences that we have made up and the perceived differences that create our fears of each other will drop away. When you can live your life as if you were living from the reality of oneness consciousness, you fulfill that scripture in the Bible that says that you are in the world, but not of the world. When you become a human of oneness consciousness, you're able to live your life as one who is in the world, but who is not of the world. And that is what oneness consciousness is all about.
Yes.
So go ahead, Tez.
I was just going to add that you know, the research, and it's particularly around quantum physics, but other science-based research, we used to think that consciousness was created from us.
Yes.
You know, that we generate consciousness. And the new research says that actually there is a field of consciousness from which all things are created, including us.
Yes.
And I just love that science is verifying kind of what we've always known to be true in our hearts. And so I just wanted to add that part. Yes, yes, yes.
Yes. And then this gets to one of the areas of complexity with racism, because for more than 50 years, our government and a select group of scientists have been looking at the personal consciousness of human beings. They've been studying this and studying it. And here we're in an area that is beyond technology and beyond science, because science has not yet been able to fully understand this arena of consciousness or define consciousness or anything of that nature. There's still struggling with it. But there are those highly sensitive people who are friends of ours who can tell us about these things, and we have been working from that knowledge. There are, and this is the report of people who know and who have gifting that I certainly don't have. But the report is that there are 7 concentric circles of energy surrounding your biology that constitute your personal energy, that 87.5% that I spoke of earlier. In addition to that, you should understand that you are multi-generational. You carry within you all of the information from generations of your experience back at least 14 generations, that you're multidimensional, that it's possible that you could be living in different dimensions at the same time that you're having the experience that you're having now. So these are factors of your quantum expression. You are also a being of quantum fullness, quantum capability. You live in a universe of quantum mechanics, and you're not living in the physics, the classic physics. You're living with quantum physics, and that gives you many expressions at your energetic level that people don't talk about much because everybody is not conversant with this conversation. So it's important to understand that. And as I looked for the root of racism, I thought initially that it was biology, but then my intuition began to show me energy and allowed me to pursue energy and how it works as a human being. Please suspend your disbelief and know that you will complete your humanity when you learn to understand that you have energy that is surrounding you, that is personal to you, energy that will respond to you, energy that knows your voice and will respond to you. It's your energy, and your greatness is there to be revealed if you connect with it. Go ahead, Tez.
I love that. Of course, because you and I have talked about this, and the not yet means that all potentiality exists within that consciousness.
Yes.
And so as co-creators, we can begin to tap into that. And I think we do,
Yes.
as we are creating and transforming our current realities. So thank you.
All right. So that experiment that I wasn't able to remember earlier was called the Blue Brain Project. So Google that, the Blue Brain Project. It wasn't a successful experience, but within that experiment, they discovered these 11 levels of consciousness available to the human brain. Now, let's turn to the learning system. The learning system was initially created in a brief afternoon. After Thanksgiving dinner in 2017, I sat down with my youngest daughter and her husband, both PhDs. My daughter applied behavioral analysis and her husband social sciences. And what I wanted them to do was to help me outline a learning system to end racism. And we did that. Took us a couple of hours, and we had it outlined. The learning system was beta tested in the following February with 17 people from around the globe. And we knew after that beta test that we had something that was workable. I always envisioned it to be dynamic, and I have found that to be true because approximately every 6 months, there is a more advanced, more enriched version. And the current more enriched version has not been fully documented, but it is about the energy and consciousness that adds to what was already there. So the learning system is designed to be a 7-week series of 90-minute webinars. And lesson 1 is about how and why race and racism were initiated. Lesson 2, how the hypothesis of race became racism. And I should say the false hypothesis of race became racism. Lesson 3, how science was abused to validate race and racism. From the time that science and the scientific method was created, it was used to validate the hypothesis of race and racism, and that was pretty much minimized by the 1930s. Lesson 4, the keys to race and racism in the 21st century. You'll find the keys to race and racism in the 21st century in all of the preceding history. And one thing I want to point out particularly is the relationship through the years between racism and trauma. Where you find racism, either small or large, you will find trauma. And the trauma is first to your energy, and progressively, you will find that trauma causes injury to your energy. And when your energy is injured, what happens is there are blockages, there are redirections of energy flows. The normal flow of energy through your system can be interrupted, blocked, redirected. And when this happens, the normal information that is transferred between various energy systems that support your biology will create vulnerability to sickness, vulnerability to illness. And if this goes on for many, many years, 15 to 20 years, that will probably turn into chronic disease. And in the worst cases, it will result in premature death. So if you are allowing racism to proceed uninterrupted within yourself, within your family members, you are turning yourself and your family members over to the possibility of illness, chronic disease, and possibly premature death, because racism and any other perception that you have that is inadequate violates who you are as a energetic system, as a human system. And if you look at the research, you look at the studies, you will see this. And what I see, many athletes are starting to talk about mental problems. What they need to understand is that before they have a mental problem, they have an energy injury. And the energy injury precedes the manifestation of a mental problem or a physical health problem. So this is critically important. And this also applies to all of these people who are promoting improper responses to what they call critical race theory. It is dangerous to use words when you don't know what you're talking about. Words have energetic power. Words have energetic authority. And when you use words improperly in the way these people are, they're trying to prevent children from learning the truth. Preventing children from learning the truth is toxic to the health of those children. It is best, even though it might be difficult, even though it might be challenging, even though it might be painful, it is better to endure that pain than to allow racism to continue within that person, particularly children. It is better to give them the truth and not another lie, because that only adds to the trauma that's already there. And I call the accumulation of trauma weight. When the trauma weight is great, illness is close behind it. Tez?
I had a little bit of a technical glitch. So we're talking about trauma. And I have also had quite a lot of experience in trauma and trauma-informed practice. And as Rich said, the new studies talk about just how the traumatic experiences, and we're talking about the trauma of racism, how that affects the brain, and then the energy systems and the body's response to that. And so my experience is mostly with working with early childhood teachers on how to work with children who are diagnosed as behavioral problems. Almost all of them are children of color, and all of them have experienced the trauma of racism. So, so we know a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that that changes the structure and the functions of the brain, particularly those involved in learning, in memory, and involved in impulse control. But also the studies tell us so much more about the effects of trauma on the brain. They talk about a lack of trust of others, anger, irritability, nightmares, fearfulness, inability to connect with others. And so if you can imagine the challenge of growing up and living in a racist culture, that it isn't post-traumatic stress disorder, but ongoing traumatic stress disorder, and the effect that that has on both children and adults. And it's a constant state of, and you've all heard this, I think, a constant state of fight, flight, or fright on an ongoing daily basis. So you can imagine how the brain is affected by constantly being in that state. Also, we know, Rich touched on this briefly, but the whole field of epigenetics, which is that you can inherit your trauma from generations ago, and that can affect you today. And that's because there are changes at the cellular level that when trauma and stress in large order affects us, that it affects our brains, and at the cellular level, we are changed. That's epigenetics. And so more and more studies are coming out about the epigenetics from slavery and how that trauma affects people of color, Black people today. So we know that racism negatively impacts people of color, but it affects us white folks as well. And I can pull from my own experience about this, and I know there are studies out there as well. And the first thing that I would say is caring, compassionate people. When we begin to learn about racism and the effects of racism, that we have a couple of kind of natural yet not very helpful responses. And one of them is just to move into denial of the reality of racism. When we do that, we're actually in collusion. Instead, we need to open our hearts, open our minds, and really learn about how racism affects all of us. And in that way, we can move through that denial to a place of health. Fear and ignorance, at the bottom of all racism is fear and ignorance. And who wants to walk around in, again, these virtual reality suits we wear, being fearful and ignorant? And yet that is often at the core of racism. For me personally, in the years ago, when I learned about the history of racism and the fact that folks came from all over the world with their diversity. And in those days, what we were being taught was you go into a melting pot and everyone comes out white and white middle class, blah, blah, blah. And of course, what that did was rob me from my own knowledge of my own cultural history. I was disconnected from who I was in my identity because my mother, who came over as Irish, had to let go of her identity. It was so shameful that she couldn't even speak of it and therefore did not share it with me. And so we're all deprived of our history as well as a full knowledge of history, of the important accomplishments of so many people of color, and the realities that others face every day in a racist culture. And last but not least, if we are really, well, let me give you two more. So that when we begin to experience the injustice of racism, of course, it's overwhelming. And of course, it's not as overwhelming as those who are living it every day, but as caring, compassionate people, that injustice cuts deep. And we can, again, we have choices. We can move into powerlessness. What can I do? I'm only one person. Or we can move into our own heart, our own learning, our own desire to do something that takes us into the last piece, which is unity, consciousness, and oneness. And we know that separation consciousness is what drives racism and other forms of systemic oppression. So we need to remove ourselves from that separation consciousness if we're going to be able to move into unity and oneness. We need to remove those barriers of separation, perceived separation, because of course we could never be truly separated. So, so that's what comes to mind for me about the trauma of racism and recovery.
Yes. Thank you, Tez. Thank you. I want to leave as much time as we can for questions. So I want to just finish off on the learning system. I went through lesson 4 and got passionate. Lesson 5 is about language, the law, and media, and how they maintain our attachment to race and racism. Lesson 6, we already talked about the grave consequences of race and racism uninterrupted. And lesson 7 then is the lesson that I just really love that lesson. Freedom freedom from unconscious identifications and attachments to white supremacy, white privilege, and white income inequality. This is the lesson where we pivot to energy, spirituality, consciousness, and how they can help us deliver ourselves from the prison of racism. One more thing about Trump. From 1705 until the end of the Civil War, Africans living in America as slaves lived under a law that said any miscellaneous white person was authorized to maim, and that used the word maim or kill any African who transgressed in the slightest way against the slave codes, and that miscellaneous white person would not be held accountable legally for doing that. Imagine living for more than 160 years under such a law. Imagine the trauma that would produce if you had to live that long and your children were going to live under that same law. The accumulated trauma in generations of African people, including those now living, contain the trauma of that law. We're now ready for questions.
Thank you, Rich and Tez. And I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and turn on your video and join the conversation here. And I know we do have some questions already. I think it was Kevin Cosgrove also wanted to ask a question. So you can raise your hand by going to the reactions and raising your hand that way, or you could just wave me down questions, comments. Kevin, you're unmuted, and did you want to speak?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to make some comments about the gentleman who just spoke before for a good while. Some points that he started out with. You know, he was talking in the beginning about how we have to erase racism because we're all humans. But then it started, as soon as that ended, it started going into there at the end, white privilege and all this other stuff. So in his beginning part, it was an assumption that we have to get rid of racism, right? Because we're all human. And that was the statement that was made. Towards the end, all you heard was leftist talking points, which are about white privilege, white this, white that, blah, blah, blah. And then critical race theory, how it's being misrepresented. That's not like, that links nowhere. It started off with all nice, like kind of kumbaya, but then it went straight to that kind of talk.
Is there a question, Kevin? Is there a question?
I actually just want to make one more comment too.
Okay.
As far as why the judge said that the people who had got shot in Kenosha couldn't be called that was because it hadn't been established yet if the person who did the shooting, the young gentleman, was doing it in self-defense or not. So it hadn't been established yet by law. He was arrested for it, right? Under suspicion and for having a firearm and shooting somebody, but it hadn't been called either or deemed by since he was going to trial, they couldn't say that they were victims, because if it had been decided that the gentleman shot them in self-defense, they were not victims because he actually was being attacked. So that's the reason why that the judge instructed him that, because the motive hadn't been fully vetted in a court of law yet. It had nothing to do with his skin color. It had to do if he was being attacked and he had self-defense. As far as, some of the stuff that he says, I highly disagree with some of the stuff that it says. Of course, I'm against racism and everything like that, but I just don't like the way that people sometimes talk about things and they're not saying things factually and they're saying things from a point of view that has nothing to do with legality or factual statements, and it's more of an opinion and emotions. I just wanted to state that.
All righty. Rich, would you like to comment?
Oh, I would just say that I appreciate his comments. I honor his comments. He has the right to think, interpret, and receive in whatever way he does. He has a certain value set, a certain history, and a way of interpreting information that comes to him. I honor that.
Thanks, Rich. And we all do. So I also honor his opinion and his thoughts. Thank you.
And I just want to mention that at the outset, Rich, you said this was going to be a very safe and anyone could say anything that they want to. And so I'm going to turn it over to Pamela Giroli.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a very interesting experience when I was in my 20s. I went to a high school reunion with my aunt, and my grandmother was Portuguese and married an Irishman. And apparently, which I had not realized until this moment when I went to a reunion with my aunt, they were not viewed as being as worthy or whatever.
Yes.
So at this reunion, my aunt went up to the coach and said to him, "Hi, coach, I'm Lorraine. And do you remember me? My brothers were on your wrestling team." And he said, "Dykens," their last name was Dykens. "Dykens. Oh, yes, you were from that foreign family." And when he said that, I just about lost it because I had no idea what my mother and her siblings had endured. They were Catholic in a Protestant area. They were from a very large, very poor family. They lived out in the country, and the kids from town were very critical of them. And I had no idea until that moment. And then, of course, I explored that with my mother and her siblings. But I realized one generation makes a big difference. And but I have always felt such deep connection and compassion for other peoples from different cultures, from different educational levels and things like that. And I just wondered if I inherited that because of what my mother experienced.
Yes. Yes.
The short answer is yes. Go ahead, Ted.
And I really, of course, resonate with you because of the story I told. And I inherited some, actually, the reason that I committed to this work at a very young age was because of my mother and her experience with racism in the South. And so, as well as her own family heritage coming from Ireland. So I love that. Thanks for sharing.
One other thing that is interesting also is that when my grandmother married my grandfather, who was Irish, she was disinherited and ostracized from her family and lived in poverty when they were very, very wealthy landowners and ranchers.
Yes.
It's one of the ways. Go ahead.
Pamela, you get it double. You have Portuguese on one side, Irish on the other. Before Africans were designated hereditary heathens, Irish were designated savages by the Queen of England. And that was before end time. So you get it twice.
Yeah.
And then there's the German half.
Again, that melting pot, you know. We
Now-
all went in with our own cultures and came out homogenous
Yes,
and hiding our own
yes.
cultural heritage.
When you
Yeah.
bring in the Germans, you take it back to Tacitus, back to before Christ.
Yes.
Heavyweight.
Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Sheila, did you want to jump in here?
I do. I was raised in the North and thought I was, not racist at all. And until I started learning the details of what constitutes racist behavior, it isn't always having a conscious awareness of what you're doing or what you're thinking. It's so assumed and understood or whatever. And so I've spent most of my adult life, after having several experiences in my face, make me wake up to what I had been living in, and participating in. And I've, so I've been very conscious about changing that. And to this day, I still take the implicit bias test just to check myself out a little bit better. I keep trying. I attend things like this because I realize that the educational system, a system
Yes.
that I was raised in a very mixed racial part of the North, in a very industrial city that was full of immigrants, in the town where Toni Morrison was born. And so she was our hometown hero, or one of them. And yet I keep learning our history that was hidden from me. And that was systemically decided to be done. I received the whitewashed version of our history. I was fully adult before it dawned on me that this idea of slavery wasn't completely over, nor that it was the birth of our nation was, based on that kind of economy where it was fought for and believed in and, and it hasn't gone away. Laws have changed, but minds have not. And so I'm grateful that I got to hear more that I didn't know in that last part about that law that you were talking about. I didn't know that. I'm also very interested, I'm going to switch a little bit here to the consciousness part. When you were talking about that were, 13% biology and 87%?
12.5%. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'd like to look into that more. Is there a place I can go to find more about that?
You won't find that explicitly, but if you will send me an email address, I will respond with a video with a friend of mine who taught me these things about consciousness.
Great.
Oh, and the other thing about not passing the implicit association test, Dr. Banaji, who was one of the co-creators of the implicit association test, to the best of my knowledge, she has never passed it herself, and she created it.
Well, and we're all fish in the water here in this culture.
Yes.
We just don't recognize what we don't recognize.
Yes. It is like peeling back the layers of the onion, right? And we should celebrate that we are evolving, because we couldn't have avoided our biases and our racism because of exactly what you said. All of the systems that surround us that create this culture have racism embedded in them, along with other systemic oppression. And so the good news is, though, is that we learned it, right? So we can unlearn it. It is about paying attention. And it is about continuing to commit to that ongoing learning, and celebrating who we are, really, as well.
I've heard it said that the unconscious is healed by consciousness.
It
by
is
becoming conscious about what you're unconscious about.
paying attention. And that's what you've been doing. So good for you. And I think we talked about Rich's email, but didn't give the email address. So Rich, would you like to share your email address? I know that you're always open to people needing more information, wanting more information, discussing how they can get more information from you through some of the classes and the other things you're doing. So do you want to share that?
I'm sharing it in the chat now.
Perfect.
Good, and it's also in the event announcement. We have all your contact information. And I want to squeeze in a few more questions here. Diana had a comment question. Go ahead, Diana.
If I understood you correctly, you were saying that critical race theory, the term critical race theory, is not appropriate or is not accurate. And from the beginning, I did not feel good about that term because everybody is reacting so negatively to it. And I wonder what the origin was of that term, critical race theory. And am I right in thinking that you don't think it's appropriate?
Well, the origin, as I understand it, it came out of law schools. And what it's being used for is to prevent children from learning the truth about American history. That's what it's being used for, regardless of its origin. And my point about that was, if you prevent children from learning about their history, then you're creating an aggravation to the trauma that they have already experienced by the lies that they have been told about the history. And that's the problem, because that adds to the trauma that they've already experienced. And that then creates a situation where potentially over time, their biology will become vulnerable to illness and disease and perhaps premature death. That's what I'm concerned about.
And also what was stated, Rich, was really that the term, as you said, is really explosive. So I would encourage everyone to Google it and really read the true definition of critical race theory. And so I think we're in a culture right now that words can become very explosive in and of themselves, even though we really don't know what the true definitions are. And so everyone gets to choose for themselves, right? And so I would encourage you to Google it and find out how it's actually defined. And then you can decide whether you agree with it or not. So.
Well, in our recent gubernatorial election in Virginia, a lot of the reaction,
I know,
was to critical race theory.
Yes,
and I'm
as
sure
a term,
people do not know what it is.
They do not know what it is in general. So, and then I wanted to add one thing about around words and language, because Rich was so eloquent in talking about the power of language. In the sacred text, it's stated that our words last 1,000 years in the universe, just our words. And so when I first learned that, it caused me to be far more intentional about what I spoke. And so, yes.
Yeah.
I think we're actually winding down our time, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And just a little bit to add to what Tez just said, your words carry your energy.
Yes, they do.
Whatever is the quality of your energy. If your energy is positive, then your words will carry a positive energy. If your energy is negative, and this includes both your unconsciousness and your consciousness, if your words carry negative energy, that is how they will be received by the people who receive your words.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, Rich, I just have one quick question and then we'll close. How can someone take your 7-week course? Is that online? Is that a seminar? How does that work?
What I would like for people, if you're interested in the 7-week course, please send me an email, and it's something that we can do immediately.
Wonderful. And okay, I do have one other question. Where can you take this implicit bias test that you were speaking?
It's
I really want to take it.
Oh, I've got it. I've got it.
Okay.
It is implicit.harvard.edu.
Mr. Google comes up with it immediately when you put in Harvard implicit bias.
Yes.
Yeah, you can do
Yes.
it that way too.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Google.
Yes.
Well, thank you, everyone. I mean, your poem was so beautiful. You had me at the Alabaster Saints. Because I was thinking about, oh my God, I had to pray to them, and I would, knew very little about them or where they came from. And I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions or comments.